501c3 research organization dedicated to promoting American leadership for a free and secure and prosperous future. I'm Jeremy Hunt. I'm a media fellow here, and today we're going to be talking about how to overcome the military recruitment and retention crisis. Our military is facing one of its worst retention and recruitment crises since the end of the Vietnam War. Just last year, the Army actually failed to meet its recruitment goals by 25%, falling nearly 15,000 soldiers short. So obviously this has serious implications for our overall military readiness, and I'm excited to talk about this issue with our esteemed panel here. We have here to my left is Congressman Mike Waltz, who represents Florida's 6th District in the U.S. House. He also served as the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee's Readiness Subcommittee, and he's also a combat decorated Green Beret and continues to serve as a colonel in the U.S. Army National Guard. We also have Thomas Spohr here. He's a retired 3-star general with over 36 years of service in the U.S. Army. He now serves as the director of the Heritage Foundation's Center for National Defense. So I wanted to start today just by kind of giving some context and answer the question, why is this such a serious crisis? Why should folks at home care about this? And then what do you feel like led us to this point? We'll start with you, Congressman.
Yeah, sure. Well, we've seen just in the last year, really two, but it's really come to a head in the last year that the military, and particularly the Army, has had the worst recruiting year since Vietnam. And that sounds significant, and it is. But they didn't just miss. They missed by a mile. First, the Army lowered its top line by 10,000 because they knew they weren't going to make their numbers. And then after a significant push, they still missed by 15,000. And just to put that in context, that 25,000 is roughly two divisions plus, I would say, General, of soldiers that are not coming into the system. That alone, if we just put a snapshot, if we kind of put a wall or an end date on that, and we didn't roll into a follow-on year of falling short, easily 5 to 7 years to make up for those numbers, right? But unfortunately, I don't think that'll be isolated to this year. We're going to continue to see a rolling crisis. And at that point, at some point, we can't staff the overall volunteer force. And that in and of itself becomes a whole different national conversation, right? So you take that piece, and then it has all kinds of spill-on effects. The Pentagon, I expect, in this next budget request will do what it often does, which is throw money at the problem. That money will be diverted from somewhere. That will be diverted likely from other training, operations and maintenance, and other types of accounts to begin throwing money at potential recruits to come in. And so that will then have a spill-off effect. And then, of course, it has an effect down the road on the overall readiness, as normally these soldiers would have matured, become sergeants, lieutenants become captains. You don't build that corporate expertise over time, and so that gap that bubble tends to move throughout the force, through the next decade or two. So it has all kinds of effects, and then I won't even get into the other services. I think the quick story there is that every other service made their numbers just barely. But what they did was they kind of robbed from Peter to pay Paul. They have a thing called deferred enlistments, meaning someone had already signed up, but they were going to join in the future, and they accelerated those assessments so they could see a ballooning effect in the next year or two when they don't have those deferred enlistments that they were relying on to make their numbers in the future.
Wow. And General Spohr, any thoughts on kind of how we got here? I mean, so we talked about the crisis. So what do you think are some of the factors that led us here, and what do you think we can do to address it?
Yeah, this crisis has been building for some time now. We didn't really see it coming, at least most people did not, but in 2018, the Army missed its recruiting goal by 6,000, and people thought that was just a one-time anomaly. We can just knuckle through this, and we'll be fine in 2019. And ever since 2018, the Army really has not been meeting its recruitment goals. This is part, in my view, of a longer trend that we're going to see a drought in military recruiting in this country. And Many things are driving this. So the labor market's very tight. Everybody knows that, 3.6 or 3.7% unemployment. But we've been there before. We've had low unemployment in this country before, and we did not have a military recruiting crisis. What's different? So we have less and less Americans qualified for military service. That's a thing too. But we're also seeing propensity. The willingness of Americans to serve is going down. That's being driven by a number of tentacles. We can get into these. Less veterans in society, less trust in Americans in the military, many other things. But as the Congressman mentioned, this is the worst ever. The Army missed its recruitment goal in 2018 by some 6,000 soldiers. This year they missed it by 25,000. So orders of magnitude bigger than what they have done in the past in terms of missing their goals.
I think there's some fundamental aspects of American society and American youth that are also driving this. The general mentioned a shrinking pool of recruits that meet the basic requirements. There have been a number of studies that have shown now that we have an increasingly obese and unhealthy population within our youth that can't make the very basic military requirements just for entry. The Army in particular is trying to address that by now having kind of a pre-basic training so that, to get these kids, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who are so out of shape into a basic level of fitness. So I think it's a fitness problem as children are, obviously less rural, more urbanized, tend to be doing things like video games rather than playing stickball. I think there's all kinds of reasons for that. We have a nutrition problem with food deserts and other types of issues within our youth. But then you also have an increase in drug use. You have an increase in criminal records. And when you combine all of that, we only have, according to the military, according to the Pentagon and a number of studies, roughly 22 to 28% of our youth that can even be recruited from. And that's an issue in and of itself, right? And then you, I think, layer on top of that the narratives that are out there now. When you have the Secretary of Defense, the first African-American Secretary of Defense, as his first action as Secretary of Defense, to have a training stand down because of the overwhelming problem of white supremacy in the United States military, which I think was a completely false narrative. But it set the narrative within, I would think, and I'm looking forward to working with Tom and the Heritage Foundation to get some data behind this. But what minority parent or community would want their young African-American or Latino son or daughter to join a military that the first African-American Secretary of Defense is overrun with white supremacy? I would think not. And then on the flip side of that, you have, I think, a lot of families in the Midwest and the South that hear constant stories about a woke military that demonizes white people, frankly, and really has this narrative of oppressor and oppressed rather than we're all Americans. And they don't want their kids to join. And then overall, you're hearing stories of 22 suicides a day and PTSD, which is great that we're getting that awareness out there. But on the other hand, I wonder, and again, we need to get some data behind it, if that's a deterrent as well.
And talking about that, I mean, so there's a cultural issue, and then there's also, I want to go back to the physical part for a second. We've seen some services are responding by trying to relax physical fitness standards now, kind of change around the way that they are assessing.
Yeah.
So obviously the goal there would be to increase the amount of recruits coming in, but that in itself might have some issues for our overall readiness if our soldiers are not ready to fight. And so how do we navigate that, Tim? What are your views on that in terms of physical fitness standards?
Well, I've often said that the debates that are going on around these culture wars issues need to be set aside. They really do. It's a massive distraction from having our military ready to fight and win wars. That doesn't mean we don't teach history. That doesn't mean we don't have a very checkered past when it comes to Native Americans, race relations, or what have you. But we have to move forward, and we have to maintain a combat-focused military. Number one. Number two, one of the lessons from Ukraine that we've seen is that war is not all by remote control and lasers from space. It is urban, it's brutal, it's physical, and physical fitness standards matter. My point has been, rather than relaxing standards, as we've just seen the Army attempt to do, or trying to do, to the point that even Senator Tammy Duckworth, who lost both her legs in combat, said she could run the 2-mile standard faster than what the Army is proposing right now. They've lowered the standards that much. She meant that as a bit of a joke, but it had a very serious point. I've put legislation into this defense bill that says our physical fitness standards should match the job. Obviously, it is a very different standard to be in infantry, to be in the infantry, to be in the artillery, to have to haul this heavy equipment when it comes to armor than it is to be a cyber warrior or a pilot or a supply sergeant. So the legislation I have in directs the Army to go back to a gender-neutral standard. It's about what it takes to do the job and what's needed to do the job, not about black, white, or brown, man, woman, gay, straight, or any of those other issues. It's what do we need in the foxhole together to get the job done.
That makes sense. And in general, what are you seeing, what are the services doing now? Obviously, as the Congressman mentioned, we're expecting to see them kind of throw money at the problem, right, in BAA next year. What are they doing right now to try to combat this issue?
The Army is really raging a full court press on this right now. They're late to the party, but now they're trying hard. So I was talking to General McConville, the Chief of Staff of the Army. They have their Future Soldier Prep Camp at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where they endeavor to get people up to speed physically and mentally to pass the test. And that's having success, but that's a very small number of people, 500, 300, that kind of numbers. And it's a big nation, and the Army needs to recruit 75,000 a year. So they're going to have to scale that up to have any hope to get that. They're looking at their marketing campaigns. How do they better appeal to young people? It's a wicked problem because, frankly, everybody's having trouble with attracting talent. This is a problem that's bigger than the military. It's bigger than the Army. It's bigger than the Pentagon. It's a society. It's an American problem that we need to make public service and military service attractive to young people again. And we have taken that population for granted. We have become complacent and just assumed they would walk into our recruiting centers. That's no longer the case, and they're going to have to really get busy doing this. The Army is also putting their best people into recruiting. That recruiting for the longest time has been the wilderness, where you do not want to be assigned in the military. They're recognizing the error of their ways, and they're putting quality. I mean, all people in the Army are good, but the more quality people back into the recruiting field.
If I could just add to that too, I hope that's encouraging to hear. I haven't spoken to General McConville in a few months, but I hope there is a full recognition within the political leadership of the Pentagon. Look, the vast majority of soldiers I know, men and women, regardless of race, religion, socioeconomic background, they want to jump out of planes, kick in doors, defend America, learn a great skill, and do good stuff for their nation. But when you have recruiting recruiting commercials that we've spent millions on that talk about a young lady with 2 moms and that she'll be accepted, and of course we want everyone respected, and I want equal opportunity for everyone to serve this great nation. But when that's the focus, and yet your recruiting base of the 25% that still meet the standard are in the Midwest and the South, and they want to go do hua stuff, right? I just think that I hope there's a recognition that they really missed the mark there. And secondly, I think some of it's just in basic marketing strategies. I was talking to the CNO, the Chief of the Navy, and he said one of the things that they're learning from is they pulled most of their television and radio commercials and ads thinking, and I don't think this was incorrect, that most young people are obviously digesting online, not watching TV. They weren't wrong, but what they've realized now is the influencers, the parents who are helping make these decisions are still watching TV, they're still watching cable news, they're still listening to the radio, and they're shifting back to that. So I think there's been some real mistakes on top of those bigger issues. And then finally, our leaders have to get out there and sell serving to the general's point. And, receiving days and days of PowerPoint briefs and making budget decisions are a big part of the job. Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Army, or Commandant of the Marine Corps, but they've also, our leaders have to be in the schools, in the communities, talking to people about why they need to serve. And I just haven't seen that. I've seen a lot of hand-wringing about climate and about everyone, and gender issues and sexuality issues and all of those issues, but not saying this is a great place to be, and that's what we need to hear.
And, to that point, talking about leaders being in the community, talking about the importance of military service, do we think that COVID had an impact on this? The leaders not being able to be as in person and talking to individual recruits, or how much do you think that could?
I think that's a big thing, so everybody shut down during COVID, and we're still feeling the lagging effects of that. So school scores are down, and like that, recruiters were not able to get into high schools. But, speaking of COVID, there's another thing that isn't talked about often, but that is the COVID vaccine. So to come in the military, you must either agree or you must have had the COVID vaccine. And about 33% of young people haven't gotten the vaccine, and they say they're not getting the vaccine. And so we can debate the merits of the COVID vaccine, but it is a factor that is influencing and obstructing people's ability to recruit to serve right now. Yeah.
Jeremy, I would just ask the question a little bit differently, and it's just a pet peeve of mine, so bear with me. It wasn't necessarily COVID. It was our response to COVID. It was the shutdowns of our schools that, in my view, should not have happened the way that they happened, that we're seeing everything from the RSV pandemic right now, the respiratory disease that's going on in children because they weren't exposed, to recruiting, to learning loss. And in Florida, look, Governor DeSantis had our schools open 5 days a week in person in August of 2020, while other locales stayed completely closed for over a year. So I think I don't fully buy that excuse from the Pentagon, because in a lot of places, Georgia, Florida, their recruiting pool is in the South and the Midwest, and many of those schools were open. I think what was still shut down from the standpoint of travel, TDY, training, was the Pentagon, right? They shut themselves down. So this excuse, well, we couldn't get in the schools, it was, no, you weren't allowing your recruiters to travel, you weren't allowing them to have their moves. You shut yourself down, Pentagon leadership, not necessarily the schools in the South and the Midwest, which were open relatively early.
That makes sense. We've talked a lot about recruitment issues. I want to talk about retention a little bit more. Do we think that the issue with retention is as severe as a recruitment problem? And then how do our potential solutions compare? Do we have the same tools we're going to use to address both problems?
So I'll start with that. So retention is not as bad. We're starting to see some pain points within the services, that the Army has met its retention goals last year. All the other services did as well. But it's starting to loom as a thing. The good news about retention is these are people that are in the military already, and we just have to convince them to stay. We have many more levers to influence their lives. We can work on compensation, facilities, programs. We can give them bonuses. We can tell them we're going to give them a choice assignment next. And so we have a much greater influence over this population of people already in the service. For society out there in the world, we have very few levers to kind of bring them into the military, to bring them into our threshold. Once they're in, it's much easier to persuade them to stay in. And by and large, most people, when they get in, love it and they stay. It's getting them into that point that's proving to be the hard part. And so we can't take retention for granted, but right now it's not bad.
Yeah, no, I think the general nailed it there. We have a much broader menu, or the military and the department have a much broader menu of options. And I think that's where you're going to see the money get thrown at the problem, because you can have a greater return on that investment, whether it's educational benefits, moves, bonuses, retention bonuses, or what have you. I would say that in retention is where we're also seeing the vaccine come into play. So we have, not to pick on the Army, but it is where the crisis is most acute. And we've had the 25,000 shortfall. Again, that's 15,000 plus the 10 where they lowered the number. But the last numbers I've seen, and I'm looking forward to getting new numbers, the Army, Reserve, Guard, and active duty, we're looking at a total of about another 20,000 that they were seeking to discharge over the vaccine mandate. So now we're talking 4 divisions. And I could tell you Florida just came through 2 hurricanes. One in particular was absolutely devastating. I have yet to come across a constituent who said, I didn't want to be rescued because I don't know if that guardsman or Coast Guard men and women or what have you had their vaccine yet. Right? They took all the help they could get. Well, we have over 1,000 just in the Florida National Guard who are facing discharge. And here's the thing that is so frustrating, is the Pentagon has them all in limbo, right? They put in a religious exemption. They're not getting word back, although I think that process has been a rubber stamp process and a bit of a sham. If they've just said, I absolutely have issue with it, then they aren't getting paid for their drills. They aren't being sent off to the schools they need to be promoted. So they're kind of in this purgatory where a lot of them are saying, the heck with it, I'll get out. And I think from an optics standpoint, that looks a lot better. No, we didn't discharge them. They just left. Well, you kind of starved them of their career, right? And I mean, and it's just wrong on so many levels. And the final thing, because I know this is just such a controversial issue, I know there are a lot of people out there that say an order's an order. You don't get to pick your shots. I get that. Most of the shots, all of the shots that we take have been around for decades in terms of research, point 1. Point 2, as a leader, you always have to reevaluate your orders. And if it's going to cost us tens of thousands of soldiers in the middle of a recruiting crisis, and the whole predicate was stop the spread, and we've seen now, our understanding of the vaccine has greatly changed, it doesn't stop the spread, then I would think they would be looking for an off-ramp here, particularly as CDC guidance is changing. So this is something I think we'll absolutely be looking to address in the next Congress.
Absolutely.
That was a long-winded answer.
No, it was a great answer. Absolutely.
The response constantly is, well, an order's an order. Well, I think that's a bit short-sighted and sophomoric. We need to really think through the validity of this one with such devastating consequences.
Absolutely. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the NDAA. So next year, the National Defense Authorization Act, I imagine will have quite a bit of influence with this piece of legislation coming through. How does this issue compare? You mentioned that they're going to basically divert funds from other programs and resources. How do you see this kind of playing out? What are the other crises that are going to be kind of playing a balancing act when it comes to the NDAA next year?
Well, first we have to vote out this last one, which we're late in doing, and then we'll dive right into the next one. I mentioned the gender-neutral physical standards that we have in this NDAA. I hope that survives conference with the Senate. Senator Cotton had companion legislation. I think we need a lot more in general. I think we need a lot more data. Again, I'm looking forward to working with Tom on a panel on this issue with Heritage. And some surveys to understand why are recruits saying no. Why are some making initial contact with recruiters and then not ultimately joining? And then, one of the things I'm very interested in is about now in multiple generations away from the draft, the statistics I've seen, 50 to 60% of young people who do join come from military families. And I'm interested, are we looking at a double punch in if people are leaving the military early and then telling their children not to join, which anecdotally I'm receiving a lot of calls on from the veterans community. Not only am I getting out, I'm telling my son and daughter not to join this military. A lot of that is around the kind of the perception of wokeness within the military. I think some of it's real and some of it is a narrative. But I think we need a lot more data before we can take action, and that's something we'll be directing the Pentagon to do.
And let me add to that. So even though the NDAA for 2023 hasn't been, finalized, signed into law yet, it was really developed, most of it, back in April, March, April kind of thing of this year. And at that point, the recruiting crisis wasn't considered a crisis. Nobody was really talking about it until this summer. And so as a consequence of that, there's not much in the NDAA that talks about recruiting. There's a couple of requests for a report, something like that. There is no real money applied to this problem. There's no real guidance or policy changes. And I think that's unfortunate, and I'm hoping that Congress this coming year, as they look into this and conduct hearings, will see that there's much more that needs to be done, that they need to enact some new policies that make it easier to let Americans know about the value of military service and careers in that area.
So just two additional points. One thing that we've heard a lot about and we need to have additional hearings on is the new healthcare software that, and anytime I say software in the Defense Department or government, it always makes me cringe. But we're already hearing that this Genesis software is really placing a very onerous burden on the recruit for any type of basic medications. And then in the modern day, it is not uncommon for a 15-year-old to have taken Xanax or an antidepressant or experimented with some type of CBD gummy or what have you. And apparently, I'm getting tons and tons of calls on this. The mountain of paperwork that is then required is such that it is turning people away or dragging out the process for years. So that's one thing that we'll take a look at. And to Tom's broader point, I have long been an advocate of enhancing service as a country. I don't think we can go back to a draft, but I think when we're talking about just forgiving people's debt, free college, and other things that the left want, I think it's reasonable for the taxpayer to get something in exchange for that. That doesn't have to be in the military, but it can be in national parks or inner city tutoring or Peace Corps or in FEMA Volunteer Corps for disaster relief. But I think we need to get young folks incentivized to serve. They graduate high school, you go serve a year or two, and then let's start talking about some taxpayer-funded educational benefits. And we have done things in past NDAs that we're going to try to do again, like enhanced junior ROTC in high school, so that we're starting earlier with folks rather than that first recruiter outreach at age 17 or 18.
Absolutely.
And there was a commission on national service that came out, I think 2-3 years ago, that had some fantastic recommendations in it. It was very thoughtful, very well done, and we'll continue to try to take pieces of that and put them into each year's NDAA.
I just want to add that recruiters' accesses to high school varies generally. So there's some places that are relatively friendly to the military. Recruiters have access to come in, talk to guidance counselors and young people. There's other school districts where recruiters are not even welcome to set foot in the campus. And so that would be an area that I would think, especially since these schools receive federal education funding, where we could enact some policy changes, Congress could, that could maybe make it easier for recruiters.
Absolutely. And for me, I was in JROTC in high school, and that, for me, was my first kind of introduction to the military. And that's what made me want to serve, and so it's huge and critical for our kids to get that in the early age.
So let me just mention that about JROTC. There's about 3,000 JROTC programs in the United States. That's the good news. The bad news is there's over 20,000 high schools, and so you can see there's a very small number of high schools serviced by JROTC. You were fortunate to go to one that had one, but most do not.
And is that on individual boards of education and at the county level? What do we see as
Congress sets a cap on the number of JROTC programs that can be funded every year. That cap can increase with if Congress agrees to it. But you're right. The school district has to also request to be part of JROTC. So they
cost share.
Yeah, they pay half the instructor's salary. So it's kind of a mutual kind of thing. I think it's a great program and we should increase it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you mentioned. You said that this issue, back in April when they were drafting the NDAA, we didn't see this issue necessarily coming until the summer. What happened there? Why did this blindside us, so to speak? Did anybody see this coming?
There was certainly discussion of it. We kind of got some indicators and warnings in the spring, but to Tom's point, I mean, really the legislative text for an NDAA is basically done by April, May. And that's about the time the services were saying, we may fall short by September, October. And that's when also the Army lowered its overall top line goal. So there were some indications, but there wasn't just the way the cycle works. We're going to have to address this issue.
And so we were all in the Army, some of us still are. The Army has a can-do attitude. They don't like to admit defeat until they're to feed in.
Right.
And so in April, the Army is saying it's going to be a hard year. Indications are bad. We're just going to double down. We're going to try harder. That's the Army we all know and love. But there was no. By the time April came around, it was already clear to many that they weren't going to make these goals.
How long do we see this crisis lasting? And is this something that we can, with the next year's NDAA and some more, us taking it more seriously? Do you think it's something that we're going to get beyond in a couple of years, or is this a long-term problem that you see that's going to plague us for a while?
Yes and yes. I think those broader societal issues that we discussed are the longer-term underlying issues of getting young folks back into a mindset of service, appreciating the need to serve, and feeling like there's a benefit to them to serve. And how do we get young folks where they're coming out as a better citizen, learning leadership, teamwork, followership, discipline, and you do it with people that don't look like you. Right? And I think that is a huge missing point from today's society, where we're in our own little bubbles, getting fed information through social media and through cable news that only reinforces our perceptions. And what the great thing about the draft did was that it was a forcing function for all elements of American society. You got over your biases, or you had a drill sergeant's boot in your rear end to help you out. So that is a longer term. But I think Tom and we've hit on a number of things that the services could do, how they're advertising, leadership out in areas, getting the best of the military into the recruiting force, and the Marine Corps does a better job of that than the other services do, and the overall narrative. I mean, if you're looking, it's just discordant to me to say we need to attract more minorities and women, but then the constant narrative from this political leadership is toxic masculinity and the overwhelming problem of white supremacy. Yet their own study, their own data shows 100 service members out of 2.1 million, that's 0.005%, are actually participating in any form of extremism. So I think all of those things could make the problem better until we could get at those longer term issues.
This is going to be a problem until we fix it. So in the past, the military has kind of depended on an economic recession or downturn to say, well, I have no other option, I have to join the military. I don't think that changes. People talk about maybe a recession next year. I don't think that changes this equation. I think this military recruiting crisis is here until we as a society fix it and find the solutions to it.
And I want to talk too just about the importance of the all-volunteer force. I mean, we've been able to keep an all-volunteer force in the Vietnam War. Why is that important, and why is that something that we should protect, if we should protect that?
Well, I mean, I think the world is seeing right now the performance of basically a conscripted military, and that's the Russian military in Ukraine. That's a military that is not bought in, mind, body, and soul to that effort. They didn't sign up for it. They're being forced and conscripted into it. And you compare that to, I think the number one attribute of the United States military isn't it's having the best and most stealthy tanks, planes, and ships. It's its people. It's the most educated, motivated, disciplined force the world has ever seen, and that is a result of a lot of good policy since the 1970s. But it is a constant effort. With the threats that we are facing today, which I think are unprecedented, with a Chinese economy that is starting to eclipse ours in some ways, that is outmatching us in some key areas, plus Russia, plus Iran, plus North Korea, plus a still simmering global terrorism problem. If we can't fix this, as Tom just laid out, then we will have to look at some point at some type of going back to some type of conscription. I know that is very controversial to put out there, but if you look at these trend lines over the next 5 to 7 years with the threat lines that we're facing, either we cede and throw up our hands as a global power, or we fix this problem, or we go to more drastic measures.
And there are some countries that have had to go back to conscription. So Sweden, for example, tried the all-volunteer model. They weren't getting enough people, and so they had to go back to conscription. So this is not some intangible, remote possibility. It is a real potential, but that would be a tragedy for America, I think. Countries that depend on conscription can normally only keep them in service for about 2 years or so. And so a soldier or a service member that's only been in 2 years is barely trained, barely experienced. And so to make a patriot system repair person takes about a year of training. So you think about that. You'd only have a year of utilization out of them before they'd have to go back to society. And so being able to have volunteers allows us to keep people for 3, 4, 5 years for service, much more experienced, much more competent, and happy and motivated to be what they're doing.
And I'll just add one, this is near and dear to my heart as a Green Beret, because what we specialize in is training other militaries around the world, allied militaries or guerrilla forces. And the unique thing that we have is our non-commissioned officer corps. And you can't make a great non-commissioned officer in a year. A lot of other militaries try and they fail, and you end up having a lieutenant and basically 30 privates in a platoon. That is our secret sauce, and I think we lose that if we don't solve this problem.
Absolutely. The NCO Corps is the backbone of the military.
It really is.
And when I was a lieutenant, having that platoon sergeant with all that institutional memory that just, is on it and knows all the training, it's key.
Yeah, 12, 15, 18 years of getting it done, right? Yeah, it's an incredible asset that we can't afford to lose.
Absolutely. Well, as we conclude here, I want to, for those watching at home, I wanted to kind of give a couple takeaways. What can everyday citizens do to help combat this crisis? What can we do to encourage military service? Some of those practical things for those at home.
So I'll start as you're a parent, and you can talk more favorably about military service. Even if you didn't serve, you can cite examples of that. You can talk to your children about, I'm not saying push them towards the military, but at least don't discourage them towards the military. A lot of times you see people getting discouraged. And so as a parent, you can do that. In your community, you can help. You can put the word out. You can support things that celebrate veterans and veterans events. And so it doesn't require a huge change, but it's a subtle mindset that, when you graduate from high school, going to the military is a noble thing to do versus you must go to college. Nowadays, Americans are living to 80, 85 years of age. There's enough time to graduate from high school, go in the military, and then go to college and do whatever you want to do, and maybe even have a second career after that. And oh, by the way, that college that you're now attending will be paid for by the federal government. And so, I think this idea that there's 2 paths to go down. You can either go in the military or you can take the college track. That's no longer valid. You can do it all almost in America, I think.
And especially, to Tom's point, especially with the reserves and the National Guard component. Right? You really can kind of, in many ways, have your cake and eat it too, where you get a little cash in your pocket, you get some training when you have nothing on your resume. I can't tell you how many, at least, employers that I've seen where you walk in the door with some military service, even the Reserve or the National Guard, and that immediately conveys all kinds of things that we've been talking about: leadership, and discipline, and teamwork, and those intangibles that so many employers look for. So I've encouraged the business community to, everybody says they support our veterans. Well, the rubber meets the road is hiring them, right? And when people see that, then I think that's something that could be positive. And I think our narrative just has to change. The military, in many ways, has been one of the most progressive organizations in American history. With desegregation in the 1940s, decades before the civil rights movement and desegregation really fully kicked in, going to the value and benefit of a merit-based system where anyone can succeed, and it has been such a pathway out of poverty for so many people, whether a young white kid from Appalachia or a kid from the inner city or anywhere in between. It's been a pathway into the middle class for so many, and a pathway into an educated middle class. And our leaders have got to talk about those benefits. Not to mention, oh, by the way, I have yet to come across a veteran who says, I regret defending this nation. I regret my service. Wish I hadn't have done it. I mean, maybe they only served 2 years, 80 years ago. And you see these veterans still looking back on that time, those relationships, what they learned, and the fact that they gave back is something that they carry with them the rest of their lives. And those are the narratives that we should be putting forward. And then finally, especially for young kids, we as a society have got to look at it, who our heroes are, right? And who are we putting forward as the heroes we want to emulate? And I know it's it's a tired catchphrase, but mine wear camouflage, not capes. And that's something that all of us, I think, could do a better job of.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for being here.
Sure.
Thank you, General Spohr, for your commentary. It's really helpful. And for everyone who joined us at home, we really appreciate you tuning in here. Please check the website for any other events we have coming up on hudson.org, and we'll take it here from now.